All right, so I'm going to sort of come up with sort of 8 indicators of city center health. And of course, having read all the material that was sent to me by Ann and others, I realized that you've all done all this stuff. So again, think of this as a reminder, because some people say you've forgotten some of these things in the last few years and are worth reminding yourself about. So the first of these, and it's not often thought about as the first sign of health in cities. People think of jobs. In the future, cities will not be where the jobs are. They're not even already, as historically they were. The first thing is about living. Living first is actually the slogan for the city of Vancouver. And if you visited it, you realize what a fabulous place it was. Think about a city calling itself, having it as its slogan, living first, not jobs first, not shopping first, not commerce first, not kind of whatever, government first, living first. What a refreshing idea that is about thinking about cities. And I'll get back to that point in a second. Right? There's a lovely lady selling condos in Miami. And the ad begins by saying, look, it's the triumphant return of an endangered species, the urban dweller. And they have been endangered, but they're coming back. By the way, I met this woman's mother at a talk recently. Or at least she identified herself as the mother. So if you recognize anyone in these photographs, come by and tell me how you're related to them. But of course, you see, she doesn't say, I live in Miami. I live in the Everglades. Right? And here's the kind of the rub, right? Americans want it both ways. Right? She's moving to Miami, but she's moving to, of course, a place that's on the coast, facing an ocean, maybe tall enough in this skyscraper to see back towards the Everglades. So as the kind of migration moves back towards the city, there's a kind of a desire for something that, of course, the suburb was always attractive about. And again, we'll get back there in a second. So there it is, the endangered species, the urban dweller. And around the world, of course, the healthiest cities are those that have vital, often historic, sometimes new residential neighborhoods. So stop talking about jobs. Yes, it's important, but find a way to attract more people to live in the downtown area. And of course, it's Vancouver up on top. It's Cairo, just out of the blue. It's a little section of Pittsburgh, which I'll get to later, which is building lots of housing downtown over former steel mills, which are not coming back. They hoped they would for about 50 years, but they're not. But housing is. And, you know, even in Florida, look at those little townhomes. Actually kind of cheaply built, but of course, again, like the woman in the little snake-like dress of hers, she sort of lives on the river, not actually in the city. It's a kind of a urban housing at the moment. Is a kind of needs to be thought about almost as like a halfway house for recovering suburbanites, right? And of course, you have to think of it almost that way, right? Okay, so one of the things we're not doing very well is being able to attract a diverse enough audience, diverse enough citizenry to return to our cities. We tend to think about lofts or skyscrapers, at least in bigger cities. That's Seattle, which is overbuilt housing. That's my home up there. I live there in the city of Boston. It's a 2-family house. I happen to proudly own it, and I rent the lower floor, and guess what? That kind of helps the mortgage quite a bit. And below, another wonderful sort of invention of the Northeast called the triple-decker. And the city of Boston and Providence are full of these things. And they're fabulous affordable housing. But we've sort of lost our way to build affordable housing because we've discovered lofts, unfortunately. And we've outpriced, of course, most people from being able to live in a downtown area. I'm all for reviving the triple-decker. What was a triple-decker, by the way? It's 3 units, 3 identical units. And oftentimes, of course, sometimes 3 families live there quite nicely in 2- and 3-bedroom apartments. Sometimes a person owned this thing, and then the granny lived on the 2nd floor, or they lived on the 2nd floor and the kids lived below, or they rented the other 2 flats, and therefore were able to afford it while providing 2 relatively inexpensive apartments for others. So one of the things that we've lost as a culture, even as we're re-experiencing the city, is our ability to build affordable housing in the downtown. And that's, at the moment, one of the if you will, kind of one of the things that prevent more people from, of course, returning and begin to enjoy urban life. And that's a big problem. Now, why do I think that the suburbs are not dying exactly, but sort of on the way out a little bit? It's because this scene, another great advertisement for homes from the 1950s, is no longer as common as you all might think. In fact, the nuclear family, a couple of kids, mom at home, dad proudly earning the big bucks, that represents it's even less than that now, somewhere between 15 and 18% of new households in America. Think about that. We think it's 60% or 80%. By the way, the people who build homes for us think it's 100%, because that's what they do, build homes for families in the burbs, right? It's less than 18%. And the other households are made up of course, empty nesters up there, various couples, gay or otherwise, that young lady who's living in the Everglades in her wonderful costume there. Those folks represent 78%, 82%. I took a red eye here, so you have to forgive me. From Seattle, not from Boston. So you have to forgive me a little bit. So think about that. So if you believe that the predominant need to house people is for a nuclear family, you build suburbs. You build lots of bedrooms, you build fresh air, or you go to where fresh air is, you build a nice little comfy yard, and so forth. But for 82% of the households being formed in this country right now, that's not an ideal. For some it might be, but for others it's not. You don't need the big bedrooms, you don't need the big yard, you don't need to kind of commute very far. You want to have proximity to restaurants or museums or healthcare or sometimes golf courses, I guess, right? So this is something that's not fully understood, actually, by our home building industry right now. I have a 17-year-old son. I'm going to knock on wood because actuarial tables suggest that he will be able to live into his 90s. Certainly hope so, right? The percentage of his lifespan devoted to child rearing, for which the suburb is a pretty darn good place, is much, much smaller than for some of you, certainly smaller than for your parents, certainly smaller than for your grandparents. So, back in the 1940s, after the war, I mean, you went to school, maybe you went to the army for 2 years, you shacked up, you had kids, they grew up, they left, you died. Kind of, right? The majority of your life, the largest percentage of your life was dedicated towards child rearing. And the suburb is utopia for child rearing, at least for most people, as opposed to dirty urban streets and not enough open space and covered fenced yards and all the rest of it. Good schools, whatever, right? Proximity to healthy air and so forth. But folks are staying young much longer these days, and for them the suburb, probably Sex in the City, appeals to them a little bit more than a quarter-acre lot. And that couple there, after their kids go away, lives for another 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. And the suburb for them is not necessarily ideal. And yes, some of them go to Florida, but a lot of empty nesters actually work their way back to urban situations. Again, to be close to cultural activities, to close to superb health care, close to maybe their kids who happen to starting their careers there and so forth. So think about that. So if you think about, again, a culture that is dominated by the period of one's life that you breed kids, the suburb will remain the predominant form, as long as we have enough energy and all the rest of it. But if you think about the much longer beginning of life until you start a family, and the much longer time you have after your family, your offspring leave you, those kinds of places to live bode well, the desire for those places bode well for our cities. So this is one of those things that we have not yet sort of caught up yet to the fact that 82% of households are not families. And for them, a suburban home is not necessarily the best place, although some, of course, still do. But what about the rest? And that's where I think, of course, what you've been doing in Chattanooga and what we've been doing in Boston and a few other cities that have thought about this, they're providing the alternatives that the 20th century has not provided for us, given this sensibility that the suburbs are about families, and families are a predominant percentage of households in America. All right, I think I spent a bit more time than I should have on that point, right? But it's very important. All right, so what are the challenges, obviously, to living first? Well, there are many. You have to respond. It's not for everyone, so make sure that you build housing for those who, of course, want to, desire to, and hopefully can afford to live in cities. Maintaining affordability is a big, big challenge, which we've not figured out quite yet, because, of course, land values in downtowns are very high. There's usually some need for gap financing and others such as subsidies, which are hard to come by, especially when the economy is not doing very well. And then, of course, there's still this kind of latent and not always so latent continuing fear about the city as being about crime and congestion and other no good things, including bad schools and so forth. And, in fact, although it isn't mentioned as often, still the suburbs about demographic and racial and ethnic segregation, as opposed to a city where we, of course, share across those demographic lines. So there are many challenges. And yet, of course, the fact that 82% of households are not at least formed by nuclear families suggests that more housing by hook or crook will be built in cities as opposed to suburbs in the next couple of decades.